Assalamu alaikum. Let's watch this clip together and come back.
The hadith, one part of it is أن الأرض لا تخلو من حجة لله على خلقه إلى يوم القيامة. That the earth will not be devoid of a hujjah, a proof or representative of God upon His creations until the day of judgment. So this idea has appeared in other hadith as well, that the earth can never be free of the hujjah of Allah. At every given moment, every second, there must be a divinely appointed warner or guide or messenger present. In other narrations, it's mentioned that if the hujjah was lifted from the earth would collapse, it would be destroyed, it would implode. But the problem is the people who fabricated this narration did not realize that the Qur'an completely destroys and demolishes this claim. The claim that the earth cannot survive without the existence of a hujjah of Allah at every time. Every time there must be some hujjah from Allah. There must be some messenger or guide or warner or some personality who is serving as a representative of God on the earth. The earth cannot be free of this. This is contradicted by the Qur'an itself, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Ma'idah, chapter number 5, verse number 19, He says, يا أهل الكتاب قد جاءكم رسولنا يبين لكم على فترة من الرسل أن تقولوا ما جاءنا من بشير ولا نذير فقد جاءكم بشير ونذير والله على كل شيء قدير. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addressing the people of the book, He says, O people of the book, there has indeed come to you our messenger making things clear to you after a fatra, على فترة من الرسل. After a fatra means a break, a gap.
This speaker claims that numerous Shia hadiths that state the earth is never devoid of Hujjatullah, which means divine proof, are in contrast with the Qur'an and hence are fabricated. He attempts to claim that there is no Quranic basis for the belief in Imamah the way 12 Shia Islam depicts it. Because according to 12ers, the 12 Imams after the Prophet are Hujjatullah or divine proofs, while the Qur'an negates the existence of divine proofs in form of human in every era. To support his argument, he uses verse 19 of chapter 5 of the Quran, which mentions the Fatra period, which was the interval between two messengers, Prophet Isa alayhi salam and Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, during which there were no messengers. By adding the terms Bashir, bringer of good tidings, and Nadir, warner, mentioned in this verse, which are specific attributes of both prophets and messengers in the Quran, he wants to prove that during the Fatra there were neither any messengers nor any prophets, who, according to him, are the exclusive form of divine guides. This way, he depicts the Fatra as a period devoid of any Hujjatullah on earth. He also implicitly cites verse 165 of chapter 4 of the Quran to claim that after the coming of the messengers, there is no more hujjah or proof and no other divinely appointed guides and leaders. In another lecture, this speaker matters a lot on verse 14 of chapter 33, and by emphasizing the prophet being the seal of the prophethood, asserts that the exclusive channel of divine guidance has been shut down, and hence there are no more hujjajullah or divine guides after him, concluding the Imams after Rasulullah were merely pious scholars and not divine guides. This speaker's argument relies on a selective and ultimately flawed interpretation of the Quran. It focuses on 3 verses while neglecting the broader context of Quranic teachings on divine guidance, which paints a very different picture. Since our opponent bases his argument on the Quran, we mainly respond using Quranic evidence. Our methodology for understanding the Quran is derived from the Quran itself. According to verse 82 of chapter 4, the divine origin of the Quran necessitates the absence of contradictions in it. In other words, the Quran is a unified text. Hence, understanding the guidance of this divine text requires connecting its verses to derive coherent conclusions. Let's explore this together step by step. Verse 165 of chapter 4. رسلا مبشرين ومنذرين لئلا يكون للناس على الله حجة بعد الرسل. The verse talks about people's hujjah of proof against God, not divine hujjah against the people. And there is a clear difference between the two. The primary purpose of this verse is to emphasize that God has communicated with humanity through messengers in the past, preventing any excuse for ignorance. Still, it doesn't necessarily prohibit guidance through other forms of divine proof in the future or the past. It ensures accountability and suggests that guidance continues beyond the life of the messengers. Let's suppose the verse denies the existence of any divine proof after the messengers, as this speaker claims. In this case, it must also deny the Quran and human intellect as other forms of divine proof that survived after the passing of the ultimate messenger of God. And regarding verse 19 of chapter 5, يا أهل الكتاب قد جاءكم رسولنا يبين لكم على فترة من الرسل أن تقولوا ما جاءنا من بشير ولا نذير. While we acknowledge the existence of periods devoid of any messengers or prophets, we reject his conclusion about the existence of periods devoid of divine proofs and guides. Based on Quranic proofs, we can demonstrate the existence of Awsiya, the successors of the prophets, filling the gaps between the prophets to guarantee continuous divine guidance. The existence of Awsiya as divine guides and Hujjatullah in the absence of the prophets is fully perceivable by reflecting upon a network of related verses. Let's study these verses together. Verse 12 of chapter 92. Inna alayna lal huda. This verse talks about God's unwavering commitment to provide guidance. This verse establishes a fundamental principle. Guidance is God's responsibility. It's a divine promise, which is not limited to the time of the prophets, but extends throughout all ages. Verse 7 of chapter 13. إنما أنت منذر ولكل قوم هاد. This verse talks about the principle of a guide for every people. The verse reads, you are only a warner, but for every qawm or people, there is a guide. While interpretations of qawm vary, this verse highlights the continuous presence of a hadi or guide. This suggests that even after a prophet's passing, God provides a hadi for the community to fulfill his promise in verse 12 of chapter 92. The nominal census structure of the verse further emphasizes this ongoing reality. The word hadi is generic and there is no reason to limit it to messengers and prophets. Rather, it can be applied to their successors who undertake the guidance of the community in their absence. Verse 71 of chapter 17. يوم ندعو كل أناس بإمامهم. This verse talks about the importance of a divinely guided imam for the salvation of every person. The verse reads, on the day of judgment, we will summon every people with their imam. This verse underscores the importance of who a person follows in this life as his imam and leader and its effect on the day of judgment. Since the word imam is used in the Quran to refer to both leaders of guidance, as in verse 73 of chapter 21, and leaders of falsehood who invite others towards hell, as in verse 41 of chapter 28, therefore, based on this verse, on the day of the resurrection, every person who has lived at any given time in this life, based on who he has followed, and whether his leader in this life was a leader of falsehood or was a leader of guidance, he will be summoned with his leader and among his party. It's perceivable from this verse that every time period has an imam, a guiding leader, essential for a person's salvation, whether in a prophet's time or later. This verse highlights the idea of ongoing divine leadership. Hence, this verse signifies the importance of imamah as one of the crucial and decisive subjects in human salvation. Let's answer a possible objection. Why aren't the words imam and hadi mentioned in the discussed verses, interpreted as the Holy Scriptures, such as the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the Qur'an, in the absence of messengers and prophets? The answer is, although we do not reject the usage of the words Imam and Huda, which means guidance, in the Quran to refer to Holy Scriptures, we cannot find a single case in human history where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sent a divine book to people without its teacher, i.e., an apostle accompanying it. So the books of guidance were never left without divine guides to clarify them. In addition, we know that both the text and interpretation of all the previous scriptures have been altered and manipulated after the passing of the messenger to whom it was revealed, to the point of severe distortion in their message and guidance. Therefore, if there were no divine guides in the form of a human to protect the message and teachings of the deceased prophet, the divine commitment to provide guidance mentioned in verse 12 of chapter 92 would be violated. But regarding the Quran, although as we believe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has protected its text from distortion, it wasn't protected from misinterpretations. Furthermore, although the Quran introduces itself in verse 89 of chapter 16 as an explanation for everything, a guidance, a mercy, and good tidings for the Muslims, That shows it's a valuable source of knowledge that addresses what all people need for faith and life. However, not everyone can grasp its full depth or derive the explanation of everything from it. It contains abrogated verses, as verse 106 of chapter 2 implies. It has ambiguous verses, as verse 7 of chapter 3 states. Hence, people need extra divine guidance to fully understand the Quran. Due to this fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in verse 19 of chapter 75 said, ثُمَّ إِنَّ عَلَيْنَا بَيَانَهُ. Indeed, upon us is its explanation. God does not just give the Quran. He ensures that people understand it, promising to clarify its meanings. During the Prophet's lifetime, this was done by himself, as Allah commanded him in verse 44 of chapter 16, which reads, وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الذِّكْرَ لِتُبَيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ مَا نُزِّلَ إِلَيْهِمْ. And we revealed to you the message that you may make clear to the people what was sent down to them. The Prophet's role was to explain God's message and make it easy for everyone to understand. This need for explanation and Allah's ongoing commitment to providing clarification continues after the Prophet. His successors must keep the Quran's guidance alive and relevant for future generations. Now that we answered the possible objection, let's move on to other verses to complete our Quranic proof regarding continuous divine guidance through divine guides and proofs in the form of humans. Verses 59 and 83 of chapter 4, known as verses of Ulil Amr. يا أيها الذين آمنوا أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول أولي الأمر منكم فإن تنازعتم في شيء فردوه إلى الله والرسول. And ولو ردوه إلى الرسول وإلى أولي الأمر منهم لعلمه الذين يستنبطونه منهم. These verses talk about the role of Ulil Amr, those in authority. We have previously published a full video uncovering the role of Ulil Amr and their traits from the Quran that you can refer to. These two verses introduce Ulil Amr as individuals who share authority with the Prophet in terms of having the right to be obeyed unconditionally, which implies their infallibility, and in terms of being a source of guidance and clarification and dispute resolution, which implies their vast knowledge. We explained in that video that the exclusion of Ulil Amr from the dispute clause in verse 59 of chapter 4 doesn't contradict their infallibility. Rather, it's due to their lack of independent legislative authority and to show that all their rulings and judgments go back to the Quran and the Prophet's Sunnah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has granted them these authorities to act as the awsiya, the successors of the Prophet, and divine guides and proofs after the Prophet. Verse 33 and 34 of chapter 3 state, إن الله اصطفى آدم ونوحا وآل إبراهيم وآل إمران على العالمين ذرية بعضها من بعض. Indeed, Allah chose Adam and Noah and the family of Ibrahim and the family of Imran over the people of the world, descendants, some of them from others. This verse adds a historical background to our subject, showing that God has chosen specific families to share his guidance from Adam to Ibrahim's line. This tradition includes our Prophet and his family, who are descendants of Ibrahim through his son Ismail. Pay attention to this hadith present in Sahih Muslim as well as Shia sources with similar content but different wording, that the Prophet said, Allah chose Banu Kanana from the children of Ismail, and from Banu Kanana he chose Quraysh, and from Quraysh he chose Banu Hashim, and from Banu Hashim he chose me. Verse 24 of chapter 32 states, وَجَعَلْنَا مِنْهُمْ أَئِمَّةً يَهْدُونَ بِأَمْرِنَا لَمَّا صَبَرُوا وَكَانُوا بِآيَاتِنَا يُوقِنُونَ. And we made from among Banu Israel leaders guiding by our command, when they were patient and believed with certainty in our signs. This indicates that God appointed leaders among past nations, like the children of Israel, to guide after their prophets. This practice is also important for our ummah because of the presence of this widely accepted hadith in both Shia and Sunni sources, that the Prophet said, you will follow the ways of those before you. Whatever happened to Bani Israel will happen to my ummah. So just as Bani Israel had leaders after their prophets, like Yusha ibn Nun after Musa alayhi salam, this ummah also has imams to ensure guidance continues after the Prophet. Another important verse is verse 32 of chapter 35, which reads, ثم أورثنا الكتاب الذين اصطفينا من عبادنا ومنهم ظالم لنفسه ومنهم مقتصد ومنهم سابق بالخيرات بإذن الله. This verse discusses continuing guidance after the Prophet through the inheritance of knowledge by certain individuals. This verse establishes that God has chosen certain servants to inherit the Quran after its revelation, using the word istafaina, which implies a deliberate selection, not a general assignment to all Muslims. But inheriting the Quran is not merely possessing the physical text or its superficial understanding, something achievable by anyone and not limited to chosen servants, but inheriting its deeper knowledge and understanding, which is exclusive to those especially chosen, as Istafaina suggests. The verse categorizes these chosen servants into three groups, implying different capacities for inheriting the Quran's knowledge: those who wrong themselves, those who follow a middle course, and those who are foremost in good deeds by permission of Allah, the highest group. The phrase by permission of Allah, bi'idhnillah, is uniquely applied to the foremost, indicating a special divine blessing and enabling distinct from the general grace given to all who do good deeds, emphasizing their elevated status. Since piety results in spiritual purity, and verse 90 of chapter 5 equates sins with impurity, showing that avoiding sins through piety purifies the heart and soul. The foremost in good deeds possess a higher level of piety and purity than the other two groups. According to verses 79 and 80 of chapter 56, none shall touch it except the purified, a revelation from the Lord of the worlds. Accessing the deeper knowledge and understanding of the revealed Quran is only possible for the purified, where purification is not merely physical, but spiritual and moral. Thus, the foremost in good deeds, being the most pious and purified, are the most capable of accessing the Quran's deeper knowledge and are the true inheritors of its wisdom. This perception is aligned with verse 49 of chapter 29, where Allah declares the Quran, despite containing ambiguous verses and the explanation of everything, clear to those given the knowledge, pointing to an elite group with comprehensive understanding. Furthermore, verse 35 of chapter 10 states, قُلِ اللَّهُ يَهْدِي لِلْحَقِّ أَفَمَنْ يَهْدِي إِلَى الْحَقِّ أَحَقُّ أَنْ يُتَّبَعَ أَمَّنْ لَا يَهْدِي إِلَّا أَنْ يُهْدَى. Say, Allah guides to the truth. So is he who guides to the truth more worthy of being followed, or he who guides not unless he's guided? This verse establishes that those who guide to the truth by Allah's enabling are more entitled to be followed than those who require guidance themselves. Hence, the foremost in good deeds, equipped with the Quran's knowledge and divinely blessed with the highest level of piety and purity, are those who are granted the highest capacity to guide to the truth directly from Allah, making them worthy of being followed as divine proofs and guides after the Prophet. Up to here, we understood based on the verses discussed that after the revelation of the Quran, there must exist an elite group highly pious and purified by divine enabling permission from among a group chosen by Allah. Allah has caused those elites to inherit all the deeper knowledge of the Quran. Their possession of divine guidance has made them entitled to be followed by others and to act as guiding leaders of the Ummah. Now let's verify our understanding of the verses by comparing them to authentic hadiths accepted across both schools of thought and see whether the Prophet has introduced such an elite group to us or not. According to Hadith of Thaqalain, mentioned in Sahih Muslim and Sunan Tirmidhi, the Prophet addressed all the Muslims saying, I leave among you two weighty things, the Book of Allah and my Ahlul Bayt. If you hold fast to them, you will never go astray after me. They will not separate from each other until they meet me at the pond. This prophetic declaration identified the Prophet's Ahlul Bayt as inseparable from the Quran in deeds and creeds, implying their infallibility, and as a group of elites who are entitled to be followed alongside the Quran, showing their capability of guiding the Ummah. The Ahlul Bayt are from the chosen lineage Banu Hashim, according to the hadith we previously mentioned. While the brother Banu Hashim are among the chosen servants, the immediate Ahlul Bayt, Imam Ali, Lady Fatima, Imam Hassan, and Imam Hussein alayhim as-salam, as specified by the Prophet in the Hadith of the Clock, Hadith al-Kisa, are the most purified ones. Because according to the event of the clock mentioned in Sunan at-Tirmidhi and other Sunni and Shia sources, the Prophet, after gathering with his immediate Ahlul Bayt, under his cloak, supplicated to his Lord, praying, "O Allah, these are my Ahlul Bayt and my closest kin. So remove impurity from them and purify them with a thorough purification." Since the Prophet's supplications are never rejected, his immediate family, Ahlul Bayt, has been purified by Allah's special blessing from all sins and impurities. This makes them infallible and aligns them perfectly with the attribute of being foremost in good deeds by permission of Allah. Consequently, they are the true inheritors of deeper knowledge of the Quran, fulfilling the description of those given the knowledge mentioned in verse 49 of chapter 29. The principle mentioned in verse 35 of chapter 10, which binds possessing divine guidance with the entitlement of being followed, matches Ahlul Bayt's role as leaders of guidance to be followed alongside the Quran, as the Prophet mandated in Hadith Thaqalain. In addition, the fulfillment of Allah's unwavering promise in verse 12 of chapter 92 and verse 7 of chapter 13 to provide every people with a guide is showcased in the Hadith of Thaqalain, where Allah ensures guidance through these chosen successors of His last messenger to serve as post-prophetic guides and proofs. Therefore, as we showed using a broad network of verses and widely accepted hadiths, this speaker has relied on a selective reading of the Quran. He ignores the wider context of the verses that establish the continuous nature of divine guidance. The Quran's emphasis on God's unwavering commitment to guidance, the principle of a guide for every people, the importance of following a divinely guided Imam, the inheritance of the knowledge of the Quran, and the role of Ulil Amr all point to the continuous presence of divinely appointed guides, the Awsiya, who ensure the God's promise of guidance is always fulfilled, even during Fatra or after the seal of prophethood. The opponent's interpretation creates logical inconsistencies and fails to address the fundamental need for guidance in every era. The Quran's message is clear. Divine guidance continues through prophets and their divinely appointed successors. May Allah make us steadfast in the way of the Quran and the Ahlul Bayt. Amen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.